Welcome back. Today is the second set of notes in Unit 3, in which we will talk about industry. In today's notes, we are answering three essential questions. Where are the world's industrial regions? What factors influence the location of industry? And how are industrial locations changing? So first, what is industry? Industry is the manufacturing of goods in a factory or adding value to a product or service. Okay, so industry is creating goods or adding value or making goods, making money. And industry is currently spreading from more developed countries to less developed countries. The United States lost 33% of its manufacturing jobs from the year 2000 to 2010. This process is called deindustrialization. This graph shows the US manufacturing employment. We see a spike here after 1940. This is World War II, right, when our whole country shifted into war production materials. So all of our manufacturing plants were making war materials. And since then, we've seen a pretty steady decline in our manufacturing as an overall whole. And then this map shows manufacturing job loss as a share of total employment. So these states up here in the northeastern part of the United States was an area that was known as the Rust Belt. So this is where Detroit, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, those big manufacturing cities are. And these cities were home to the original processing and manufacturing plants that go back to the Industrial Revolution. And these are all the old manufacturing processing plants that have closed and have since been outsourced to other countries. Same thing with down here in the southern part of the United States. So again, this is the area that I was talking about, the Rust Belt. So where the original processing and manufacturing was located, that has since seen tremendous job loss. In Detroit, when the Ford Motor Company closed its manufacturing plant, there were whole neighborhoods of people that lost their jobs, and they literally just packed up their stuff and left because they couldn't find employment in Detroit anymore. So you see a lot of literally rundown, abandoned neighborhoods in Detroit. And currently the city is working on demolishing these neighborhoods and kind of reviving them as either green space or communal farmland. Okay, so the world's industrial regions are currently the United States and Europe. So Europe was the first to industrialize. This was the Industrial Revolution, dates back to Great Britain, who was an early leader in the steel and textile industry. After Great Britain industrialized, pretty soon the United States and the rest of Europe industrialized as well. In the United States, the earliest industry took place in the northeastern part of the United States. Again, this is where people lived at the time, so it makes sense that our jobs were in these areas. The northeastern and mid-Atlantic part of the United States has a series of large ports, so you can get the big ships in and out to ship your goods, and then a large consumer market. The Rust Belt has good access to transportation. It's all along the Great Lakes, so it's easy shipping routes. And then Southern California has an abundance of cheap labor. So this map shows major industrial regions. So we have the eastern part of North America, the northwestern part of Europe, the eastern part of Europe, and then parts of East Asia are going to be kind of your major industrial regions. And if we go back, notice all of these areas have direct access to waterways. Okay? And that's due to shipping. So a lot of the things that they process or manufacture are shipped across the world. Okay. Here's Europe's industrial centers. So again, they're all located near some sort of waterway. So even these areas in the inner parts of Russia are located along rivers. So you can put products on big shipping containers on the boats and then ship them down the river. Same thing here in North America. Okay, they're all located along some sort of body of water. So like the Great Lakes regions here. So like Milwaukee, Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, right? They're all landlocked areas. They're not near an ocean, but they are near the Great Lakes, which serve as shipping access. So another industrial region is East Asia. And in this region, the most abundant resource is people. So you have lots of people to work in the processing and manufacturing plants. And the more people you have working in a plant, the higher your product output is going to be. So the more money you're going to make. Japan saw super rapid industrialization growth after World War II, and Japan has since excelled as a leading manufacturer in cars, electronics, and skilled labor and technology. And then China is the largest market and labor pool. So they have the largest market to sell goods to people, but then they also have the largest labor pool. So a lot of industry and manufacturing that takes place in China is textile, steel, and consumer goods. Question number 1. Which of the following is an industrial region? Your answer is all of the above. So how does situation influence the location of factories? Okay. Situation, remember, is like where something is located. So here, when we are looking at industry, the location of your industries are going to be placed depending on your transportation costs. So your situation are factors that involve transportation costs. There was a geographer by the name of Alfred Weber. So his last name looks like Weber. It's pronounced Weber. I don't know. He's German. Anyways, he came up with this idea called least cost theory. And this is that a factory is going to be located based on the cost of two things. So they're going to look at how much it costs to import their raw materials, okay, to make their product, and then how much it costs to transport that finished product to market. Okay. And what Weber says is based on least cost theory, companies and factories are going to build their location closer to whichever thing is more expensive. So if it's more expensive to import your raw materials, then your factory is going to be placed closer to your raw materials. If it's more expensive to transport your finished product to your market, then your factory is going to be located closer to your market. Okay, so this is called the proximity of inputs or raw materials. So when it's more expensive to import your raw materials, those industries or those factories are called bulk reducing industries. So your finished product or your output is cheaper to transport than your raw materials or your input. So the best location for these types of factories are near your raw materials. So an example of these factories would be copper and steel manufacturing plants, okay, or places that use raw copper and steel to create things. A lot of times, bulk reducing industries are taking a large, like physically large raw material and reducing it down to something smaller in size. And that's why we call it a bulk reducing industry. It gets smaller. So this would be an example of a like junkyard. Okay, so lots of cars. These are large raw materials. Okay, and then they're compressed down and recycled into various other smaller pieces of metal. Okay, so this would be a bulk reducing industry. Okay, this is what the finished product looks like. Steel rods. So you go from a giant car, and you're going to build your factory or your mill closer to where the junkyard is going to be because it's more expensive to transport your cars. Then your finished product is steel rods. Okay, if from every car you get one steel rod, it's going to be way cheaper to transport a single steel rod than it is to transport an entire car. This map shows the location of steel mills based on proximity to iron ore deposits. Okay, so your steel mill industry, again, is going to be located in closer proximity to your iron ore and to your coal deposits than to your market or the people that you're selling these things to. Okay, so the flip side of that is when it's more expensive to transport your finished product. Okay, so this is when factories are going to build their mills or their locations closer to their customers or based on proximity to market. And this is called the bulk gaining industry. So this is where your finished product or your output is more expensive to transport than your raw materials or your input. Right? And the best location to build these factories are going to be near your customers or near your market base. So some examples of bulk gaining industries are machinery, cars, and beverages. So if you think about building a car, like what this picture shows, okay, a car is made up of lots of different parts and it's put together on an assembly line. Each of these little tiny parts are shipped to the manufacturing plant in pieces. So you get like a whole shipment of tires or you get a whole shipment of steering wheels. And then you put everything together on this manufacturing line, and then the end product is a full completed car. It's going to be way more expensive to transport a full completed car than it is to bring in all the raw materials or all the pieces to make that car. Okay, so you're going to want to build your assembly line for manufacturing cars closer to where you're actually going to be able to sell the finished car. Question number 2. A product that is easier to transport than its raw materials is called what? Your answer is going to be bulk reducing. Okay. So again, here's just a look at auto industry locations. You can see that assembly plants are going to be located closer to your major market areas or closer to access to your market areas. So what factors are important for industry, or what site factors are important? And site factors are the unique characteristics of a specific location. So when we're talking about industry, we're talking about land, labor, and capital. So how are these 3 things important? So labor is going to be your most important factor for industry on a global scale. Your labor costs are going to be the most expensive aspect of any sort of manufacturing or processing or industry. And nearly 1/2 of all industrial workers are located in India and China. And throughout manufacturing and industry, labor costs see the widest variation. Okay, so if you have a manufacturing plant in the United States, okay, you are going to spend more money on your labor costs than you were if you had a manufacturing plant in China. Okay, and that's because of the wage differential. So an average, more developed country like the United States, their average manufacturing wage, so somebody that works in a manufacturing plant or on an assembly line, is roughly $20. Okay, if you go to a less developed country, or maybe like if you go to somewhere in India or somewhere in China, that same person doing that same job gets paid $5. So you can hire more workers with the same percentage of your budget if you outsource your labor to less developed countries. So here's a graphic that shows textile costs in the United States versus in Asia. So they're 2 sweatshirts, okay? The total cost to make the sweatshirt in the United States is $38. The total cost to make the sweatshirt in Asia is $31. Okay. You can see that the sweatshirt in the United States, the majority of the budget is taken up by labor, this blue color, whereas the sweatshirt that's made in Asia, only a portion of that manufacturing budget is taken up by labor costs. Okay, so it's cheaper overall to produce your textile in Asia and then ship it to the United States and sell it for more money than it is to make it in the United States. So how does land influence location? Early factories, like post-industrial rev factories, were located in city centers. This is because this is where people lived. They had access to their labor pool and they also had access to their customers. And these factories oftentimes lacked suitable space, so they were built upwards. So you have multi-level factories, and they were often located near railroad lines because railroad were the main form of transportation. As technology increased and the size of our cities grew, modern factories moved out of city centers and are now located often in suburbs or rural areas. Modern factories are large one-story buildings, so everything's flat and spread out. Land is cheaper in the suburbs and in rural areas, so factories are able to purchase more land so they can build out instead of up. And then they are located near major highway junctions because instead of shipping products via rail line, we're now shipping products via semi trucks. So an example is the St. Paul Casket Company in 1922. You can see that it was at least 3 levels and located right near the railroad. So this is downtown St. Paul. Compared to a modern factory today in Tennessee, everything is all spread out over a wide area, and you can see its close proximity to the major highway or freeway system. Okay, the last site factor is capital, and capital is money, right? It's the wealth in the form of currency or property. So businesses can choose their locations, so where they're going to build their factory or their processing plant based on the availability of capital. So based on the availability of money. In less developed countries, you don't have as much access to loans and financing. So if a company is more of like a startup style company, they are going to want to build a manufacturing plant in an area where they have access to loans and financing versus well-established companies that have the capital or the financial freedom to kind of spend their money however they want, that don't need a loan, can build in less developed areas where they don't have access to that stuff. But then some areas also have lower taxes or tax incentives that are encouraging manufacturing and industry to build in those locations. So they can give companies like a tax cut if they choose to put their plant in this location. Question number 3. On a global scale, which site factor is the most important? The answer is going to be labor. This is your human cost. Okay, how much are you going to pay your people? Question number 4. Which site factor would be a good reason to put your factory in a less developed country? Answer is that your labor costs are going to be cheaper. You can hire more people to work in your factory for less money. The more people you hire, the more product you are going to be able to produce. The more product you produce, the more product you're going to be able to sell. The more product you sell, the more money you make. So why are industrial locations changing? In the United States, we've seen a shift that we've already talked about from the northeastern part of the United States, from the Rust Belt, to the south and the west, to the Sun Belt. And that is because right-to-work laws have attracted many employers. So right-to-work laws are where people do not have to join a union. Okay, they're free to negotiate their own wages, their own insurance settlements, things like that. So a lot of times labor unions and big companies fight or argue about wages and employee protection and insurance rights. And this can be really expensive for companies when unions are in disagreement. So companies are more likely, like large manufacturing companies, are more likely to build in areas which have right to work laws where people can work in those manufacturing plants without having to join a union. So then they don't have to worry about their workers going on strike. And then in Europe, we see a shift from the northwestern part of Europe to the south and eastern part of Europe. And this is because the United Union or the European Union wanted to promote development. Okay, so they're pushing industry southward and eastward. So like Eastern Europe has an abundance of cheap labor, skilled workers, then they have a whole other market that they haven't even tapped into yet. So this map shows your annual mean wage of production occupants. So how much money you make, like on what's your average that you make if you work in like a production line or an assembly line. So the dark blue states are areas that have higher wages versus the like kind of greenish color are states that have lower wage areas. Okay, so companies are more likely to build their manufacturing plants or their processing plants in these lower wage states because they have the right to work laws. So they don't have the labor unions that are negotiating the higher wages for their employees. Okay, and again, the blue states are the right to work states. So the ones where you don't have to have a labor union. So if you notice between these two maps, okay, the right to work states have lower wages typically than the states which require unions. This map shows Europe and its development. So the red areas are areas that are seeing an increase in manufacturing and processing, and the blue areas are areas in which they're trying to move manufacturing away. Okay, question number 5. Why is it cheaper to have a factory in the southern part of the United States? Your answer is all of the above. You have lower wages, you have right to work laws, so people don't have to join a labor union, and you have less labor unions in general. So areas that have seen recent industrial growth are going to be your less developed and your newly industrializing areas. And this is because industry in your more developed countries has declined 50% since 1970. And with this decline, companies in more developed countries are outsourcing their labor or their jobs to 3 regions. So they're building manufacturing plants or processing plants in East Asia, South Asia, and Latin America. Okay? In East Asia, we're looking at Japan, China, and South Korea. There's an abundance of cheap labor, so you have lots of people that are willing to work in these areas. But then they also have special economic zones that offer tax breaks and other incentives to attract Western businesses. In South Asia, we have India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, where we have a lot of our textile and consumer good production that comes from there. It's a very centrally located part in the world, so it's easy to ship all over the world. And then Latin America, in Mexico and Brazil, you have US companies that are building factories just on the border of Mexico. These are called maquiladoras, and they're built just on the Mexico side of the border because they offer cheap labor and easy access to United States markets. So their product doesn't have to travel very far to get to a US market, but they can still tap into the cheap labor source in Mexico. And so an example would be Sony. These are areas of special economic zones in China, so areas that they're trying to build industry that offer tax breaks and incentives. Not all processing and manufacturing jobs are being outsourced to less developed countries. Some processing and manufacturing jobs are being retained in more developed countries. And this is because there's a new international division of labor. So, where your low skilled work is often moving to less developed countries, this outsourcing, but then your more skilled technical manufacturing work stays in your more developed countries. So the more repetitive, like mundane tasks get outsourced, but then the higher tasks that need like some level of education or technological knowledge stay in your more developed countries where you have access to a skilled labor pool. And then some companies choose to stay in more developed countries because they have larger access to their markets that they're selling to. And this is called just-in-time delivery. So companies that want to highlight the availability of like next day shipping, or like next day arrival or 2-day shipping, right, are going to have plants or processing centers, or like warehouses here in their more developed countries so they can get those goods to their customers as fast as they can. So this is like Amazon Prime, guys, right? We know that there are Amazon fulfillment centers all over the United States. I can order something on Prime right now and get it by 8 o'clock tonight. By keeping a factory or processing plant in a more developed country, a company is also reducing its transportation costs because they're going to be selling to the people that live in those countries. It makes sense to build their product in that country if they're spending a lot of money on transportation, okay, to reduce that cost. So this map shows textile jobs, so like clothing jobs. And a lot of our clothing has been outsourced to outside of the United States. So if you look like on the tag on the back of your shirt, or on like the back of your pants or on your shoes or something, most of your clothes are made overseas. Right? And that's due to this trend right here, right? Where just the outsourcing in general of clothing products. This map shows compensation, so how much money people make per hour in manufacturing jobs. So the United States, right, on average was like $20, $25. Okay, so these are all more developed countries. Then your less developed countries are in pink. So they're making pennies on the dollar. So if I were to build a manufacturing plant in the Philippines, I could pay my workers like $2 an hour. Versus if I built that same plant in the United States, I'd have to pay my workers $20 an hour. So I'd be able to hire way more workers in the Philippines than I would here in the United States with the same fixed budget. Okay, so now what you are going to do is you are going to write your notes summary. Okay, the 3 questions that you are looking to answer are, where are the world's industrial regions? Okay, so this is like kind of the beginning of the notes. Number 2 is, what factors influence the location of industry? Okay, so what are the site factors? Land, labor, capital. What are those things? And then the 3rd one is, how is industrial locations changing? Well, what's outsourcing? What's happening to industry? When you are finished with your note summary, please make sure that you turn it in.